Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining this month's Little Nuggets of Tech and Telecom. We are so pleased to welcome our featured keynote guest, Tricia Paoletta. I was about to call you Assistant Secretary, so I'm promoting you, Trish. You've only been in the job for a few weeks. So excited to have such an expert, not just on spectrum policy, but both domestic and international, to join us, especially given that she is in the job just for a few weeks and is incredibly busy. So we will make this short and to the point, Trish. We really appreciate you being here. And we're joined by my co host, Jen Fritzsche, who you know very well. And Jen,
Hey, Trish.
just before we get into a discussion, just share your thoughts from the conference you're at. I thought Trish might be very interested in that, in those takeaways.
Yes. Hi, everyone. Hi, Trish. Excuse the noise in the background, but I'm in Berlin at the largest infrastructure conference, what's called PEI, Digital Infrastructure Summit. And I was saying to Carolyn in the green room that there's been a lot of talk about wireless role and the role of digital infrastructure. And, finally the edge seems very real.
And
So
Trish, I think we've all felt that, of course, not necessarily terribly surprised, but interesting that now the rest of the world seems to be on the same page that we've been on for a couple of years. All righty. Let's just start very, very high level, Trish. Given your new role, and I believe your title is Spectrum Advisor, was curious if you could share what does that mean? What is your portfolio, and sort of what are the issues that you are going to be tackling for the Secretary of Commerce and the Assistant Secretary?
Well, thank you very much. And it's great to see Jen and Carolyn, my old friends, my long-standing friends. We're all very young. Spectrum keeps us young, exciting, policy issues embedded in those airwaves keeps us just very vibrant. But yes, as senior advisor to the Assistant Secretary, it covers on Spectrum. It covers all things Spectrum, domestic and international. And well, some of your listeners might know that within last year's Working Family Tax Cut Act, there is a spectrum auctions provision, and that gave us a lot of work to do. And one big beautiful bill, as it's kind of called in Washington circles. But so within that bill, the Assistant Secretary was directed by Congress to come up with 500 megahertz, which is a lot of megahertz, a lot of juice, a lot of spectrum, to be repurposed from current federal use to commercial use for high-powered, licensed commercial broadband, consistent with how the FCC regulates, broadband today, wireless broadband today. And again, 500 is a lot. The range that the Congress told us to look at is it's mid-band range. So, 1.3 gigahertz up to 10.5 gigahertz. So a big chunk of spectrum. But then the president refined that hunt, the hunt for 500, in December when he put out a presidential memo on winning the 6G race, 6G being the next generation that mobile industry around the world is trying to standardize. And, and the agreed target basically to actually have that commercially developed and standardized is 2030. So we've got a couple of years on that. But the president wants to win the race for 6G globally. And so in his presidential memo from December, he kind of refined that range to tell us to immediately begin, we continue really the studies on 7.125 to 7.4 gigahertz. And to get going on those. And so those studies, that band of spectrum, at least the lower chunk of that, had been looked at in the previous administration. Right. So we're moving very quickly on that one, and that will likely be the first to be identified because it had been previously studied. But we're moving on that. And then the other band of spectrum that was kind of a curveball for some, I suppose, is also mid-band spectrum, of course, within the range Congress directed. And it's slower down, which makes it, less expensive to deploy for the mobile operators, and it was already in international standards. So, for the mobile industry, and that's 4.4 to 4.94 gigahertz. So again, a little less expensive. However, a very congested space for the federal users. So that's going to be tricky, but we're beginning to study that. And another band that's very important to the industry, again, because it's lower down in the range, and the lower down for your listeners, right? The lower down in the spectrum range, the signals will propagate further. Right. And that just, again, makes it more affordable for the mobile operators to deploy. And so that next band of spectrum we've been directed by the president to start our engines on is 2.69 gigahertz to 2.9 gigahertz. Again, none of these bands are easy. That range, at least starting at 2.7, is globally allocated for radar. So, it's a complex environment. Again, every band in 2026 is complex, but that's a very important band for the operators, given that they're licensed just below that range. Mm-hmm. They're already doing 5G in that band. So that's that. And then we, on our own initiative, right, have also identified the first down payment on that 500 megahertz. Just last month, we identified a bit of spectrum, 5 megahertz, in 1675 to 1680. And we notified the FCC we're going to be studying the next 15 megahertz up. So the total that we could possibly repurpose for commercial use, for full power commercial use, would be 20 megahertz. And that's one of the channel sizes that the industry is deploying and will continue deploying for the foreseeable future. So I'll stop there. A lot of numbers, a lot of ranges, but that's certainly a priority. So the domestic implementation of the One Big Beautiful Bill. And then some of those bands, like the 7 gigahertz band, the 4 gigahertz band, are being studied internationally and for a global conference, a world radio conference that's coming up next year that the United Nations hosts. And so, we're also, part of my job is also helping the U.S. get ready for that World Radio Conference on the mid-band study item, but there's a ton of satellite issues as well that will take up a lot of our time here at NTIA. And then finally, to answer your question, like anything on spectrum, the FCC does a lot of stuff on spectrum, right? So anything on spectrum is sent over to NTIA, and we circulate FCC proposals and draft to our federal agencies, and we chair an interagency committee of spectrum management users and their respective agencies of the federal users, and then we gather those comments and we'll send them back to the FCC. And this is one thing, I haven't been in government for a long time. There's a lot of governance processes, and of course OMB will get stuff, right? And then they'll send it our way too. And then and anytime some of our senior officials are addressing spectrum issues, whether it's the secretary or the deputy secretary, I am called in to take a look at it. So it's fun. It's a lot of work and I'm enjoying it, and it's multitudinal.
Let me just ask you, I'm going to ask you two questions and then turn the mic over to Jen, one of which you may defer and not want to answer, but really meant in a lighthearted way, which is, you are such an expert. You have so many years vested in the industry, both internationally and domestic, and have been around spectrum issues, satellite issues, et cetera, for a very long time. So I think the lingo is something you're very familiar with. When you walk into the secretary's office, do you get the sense there are folks that understand the details of spectrum, or is it all just kind of gobbledygook when you get to a certain senior level within the agency, or within the agency?
I've been, this is my 5th week, and I have not yet breathed the rarefied air of the secretary's office. But I did look at a memo prepared for him yesterday, and a colleague had prepared it, and the colleague did have very technical language in there, like in terms of the strength of the satellite signal when it touches the Earth, and when it's in a numeric, formulation. So, whatever it was, I don't want to misquote, because then I will be revealed as not really being a technical expert. But it had a lot of ERIP, a lot of technical terms in there. And I thought, okay, the fellow who prepared it has been in this role for a good year, so who knows? I was impressed with his sense. So I gave the gender away. That the secretary would understand these technical terms. So maybe
that's great.
It does.
I think it's very reassuring.
Yes. So it's like, all right.
So my
Erin Roth, who is our assistant secretary, I guess she's done a great job educating him. But so.
All right, now my second question, which is more serious, and that is, given that there has already been significant effort expended on studying the seven pursuant to the big beautiful bill, what is your is the are you guys looking at this sort of seriatim? So you complete your study, you make your recommendations on seven, and then you turn to four, or do you begin studying four now while you're still looking into seven?
Yeah, the latter. So
Okay.
we'll begin studying that very soon. Well, we are studying it. Like the process has already begun, and I've been incredibly impressed with my NTIA colleagues. They run a tight ship around here. Yeah, so all the agencies are actually already like getting the work done, and there's a whole statutory process.
Right.
That is laid out in our pre-existing. Before the one big beautiful bill, there's a title within the code that deals with communications. That lays out like what you have to do first. But yeah, so a lot of that activity will be overlapping. So we're already studying the sevens, and the the president, the big beautiful bill. Basically, the big beautiful bill told NTIA, as I mentioned, identify 500 megahertz, but we have to do 200 megahertz within the first 2 years. So July of 2027, right? And I mean, typically it takes a long, long time to do these studies because, and to figure out part of the study is the relocation costs because these systems are not like iPhone or Samsung's, right? That every 2 or 3 years you get to toss them up, or luckily if you luckily you upgrade, right? But that is not the way the federal systems work, right? And they need to be appropriated, and Congress needs to pay them out, and the manufacturers don't churn out some of these more advanced, complicated systems, like say a radar or whatever. And there's an evolution in those technologies too, right? So anyway, all to say, we need part of the study process is actually coming up with the relocation cost, and that we take a lot of the agency's data in on that. We apply our own kind of expert prism, and technically even after we identify the band that, like, yes, we could repurpose this. This will be the cost, and we'll tell the FCC this is going to be the cost. And then the FCC will look at that, and then they will give notice at least 18 months to the NTIA and the rest of the world that, okay, we're going to have an auction now. And that auction will not actually be effective. It won't clear, or the auction won't be effective unless the actual final bid clears the relocation costs by 110%. So the auction is not effective and can't be legally, the FCC couldn't award licenses if the proceeds from that auction weren't actually 110% of what the relocation cost is, or more than 10% of the relocation cost for lawyers there that might struggle with math. So part of our process is getting those relocation costs. But in terms of actual start date, we're already starting the studies on seven. The studies, we just notified the FCC about commencing the studies on the 1675 to 1695 or L band, or for some of the spectrum gurus out there. We'll be initiating the actual studies, right? But we're getting the data from other agencies on their transition plan, their plan to move out stuff, right? We're already getting those. And then for the 4 gigahertz, after we get the transition plan, so the studies will actually begin like in the summer or fall of this year. Okay. So there's some overlap, there's some pacing, but we're not waiting till we identify 7, hopefully at the end of this year, right? But anyway, everybody's working hard. And
so no summer travel for you. No summer travel for Trish.
Yeah, but I'm doing plenty of other travel because part of my Spectrum advisor role is also helping the U.S. team, or Team USA, advocate for our U.S. candidates at the International Telecom Union, which is the United Nations body that has this World Radio Conference at the end of the year or end of next year. Anyway, so we're doing, part of my duties as assigned is to go around the world and ask for the votes for the U.S. candidates and for our own. The U.S. government also is up for re-election on the kind of the executive committee of the ITU.
If there's anyone who can be convincing, Trish, it's you. Jen, over to you.
Maybe I'll jump in there, Trish. On the World Radio Conference, the preparation is clearly beginning, and it sounds like your boss, Ariel Roth, is really firmly in favor of getting organized now, if that's a fair statement, and developing a strategy to execute on a kind of a pro-America suite of proposals. As you kind of prep for that, what do you see as the biggest challenges going into that conference?
Yeah, certainly. Thanks, Jen. Certainly the mid-band spectrum studies that I had mentioned are going to be tricky because, everybody's already in spectrum and it's very hard to move people out. And and again, the U.S. is not the only country that has a lot of federal or, government systems in some of those bands, the 4 gigahertz, the 7 gigahertz band. So it will be challenging to get other countries comfortable with what's called identifying. You identify a band for a particular application, so to get other countries to go along with U.S. positions to identify bands for commercial mobile broadband will be challenging. And part of the challenge is because China does not prefer the 7 gigahertz band. They're pushing another band of spectrum, so that's a challenge. And this conference is in China, so that is going to be an additional challenge because just under the existing ITU rules, whoever is the host picks the chairman of the conference, and that chairman gets to pick the vice chairs of all the working committees that make the conference flow. So, we have some kind of structural challenges, and, it's been practiced, certainly not codified in the ITU's rules, but it's been practiced to give the host country, like their golden ticket, like what they really want, but nobody else really wants. Come on, do them a solid because, gee, they've hosted us for a month. It's a month long, so that's a factor that could be a challenge for us. Again, it's not codified, but we'll be dealing with that. Now, on the flip side, and on the other issues, right? Even though domestically those are tricky bands because of federal incumbents, and again, we have our direction from the president and Congress, so we're doing the work. They're tricky bands, but the actual agenda it's dominated numerically by satellite issues, and some of those satellite issues are, of course, direct to device. I think maybe that's even getting out into the lay people, terminology. But basically, if you watched the Super Bowl a year ago, right, a year and a couple months ago, you saw T-Mobile and SpaceX had their ads about using satellite technology to extend the reach of your handheld device. And of course, Apple and Globalstar had the iPhone 14 out a couple of years ago at this point with direct to the device SOS or emergency services. Anyway, there are 3 different agenda items that kind of touch on direct to device. So direct from the satellite to the device, technologies and power limits, and a lot of technical requirements or questions to be solved, like how far from the border do you ensure that the satellite signal cannot touch, and so not to create interference to another country's mobile operator that might not have signed up for direct to device, right? So you have a lot of technical issues we're working through. Those are going to be high profile, and part of it is the U.S. has led in the development of non-geosynchronous satellite, or low Earth satellite. What SpaceX does, right? And increasingly others like Amazon Leo is launching their system as well. They got to the market a little later than SpaceX, so SpaceX is kind of the big boogie in terms of these international discussions. But they will have thousands of satellites, small satellites in their constellation, once they're fully, deployed. And that is causing some angst from in countries that are less evolved, or in terms of technology, and or countries that have had a more top-down government-controlled market, and their mobile operator, their satellite operator might have government investment, really can't compete with a perhaps lower cost LEO system. And so anyway, we're market access issues for non-geosynchronous systems, or LEOs, low Earth orbit systems, are certainly intertwined in a number of the satellite agenda items. So satellite generally, particularly when it comes to LEOs, is going to be a huge issue at this World Radio Conference.
Jen, I think you had a question on C-band?
Sorry, that's great. Thank you for that color, Trish. I guess one last question for me is upper C-band. You alluded to it, that auction. I don't believe the rules have come out, and I'm curious if you think carriers who participate would be allocated to a limit to what they could buy, like we saw in the 345 auction, or no limit like we saw in the first C-band auction.
Yeah, and it's interesting. We haven't yet seen any signals out of the FCC on that. This is obviously a Republican nominated, confirmed chairman, less market dictating and more reliant perhaps on market demands, signals. So we haven't seen that there's going to be a limit in terms of how much spectrum a particular winning bidder can hold, or how many channels that could be aggregated by a particular winner. Just for your viewers, listeners, background, to date, the U.S. had allocated and assigned spectrum up to 3980 megahertz, right? And that the big beautiful bill directed the FCC to auction, more of that spectrum. And globally, that band up until 4.2 gigahertz had been identified by the mobile community in their standards process, a long time ago. So the FCC is kind of looking how much of that upper C-band can be auctioned for the industry, while still not interfering with radio altimeters that are used by airplanes when they're landing and taking off. And that is a global issue, obviously, but the upper C-band, and this wasn't your question, but that won't be so much of the World Radio Conference, but NTIA's interests there are ensuring that the federal users, like FAA, right, the Federal Aviation Administration, or federal regulators, because it's FAA that regulates, of course, the aviation industry, while they're flying, and certainly in airports. I guess flying generally, aviating generally, but so we're involved in that just to make sure that the altimeters will continue to function as airplanes are landing and taking off, because obviously that's an important couple minutes of passenger safety. But we haven't seen kind of spectrum screens or aggregation limits, being talked about. So.
Hey, Trish, can I ask you a quick question? I know that you were not in you weren't in-house, so to speak, in the government when all of this was happening many moons ago. But do you have a flavor, just from people still in the building, that the coordination process between NTIA and the FAA and the airlines and the industry is progressing maybe a little more smoothly than perhaps it had, last go around?
I think so far, yes. And I haven't had personal experience with that, other than, in this current role, but I did, before I moved over here last fall, I did attend NTIA Spectrum Symposium, and a senior political official from, appointee from FAA was there, and he certainly spoke about, and this was, of course, after the One Big Beautiful Bill, which did dictate to the FCC to auction a certain amount of spectrum from that upper C. And trying to be all in, and and we're seeing in other areas follow through on that spirit. So yes, I think coordination is working better. And and if those who may have read the presidential memo, particularly on the bill, the bands of spectrum I outlined,
Right.
which again does not include the C band, but the particular White House offices will be more involved in some of these thornier spectrum issues. So it will give less leeway for politicals and careers and other agencies to drag their feet.
Right.
So.
All right, last question. I know both of you turn into pumpkins in about 2 minutes, so this will be quick. And it can be a one-word answer, I think, Trish. And that is, of the spectrum you guys are identifying, obviously there is very firm directives from the legislation and the memo in terms of what you're looking at. And then as you noted earlier, Ariel Roth and the team has also gone ahead and identified some additional spectrum. Given that, looks like you have some flexibility, so obviously you have to remit, and meet your mandate. But is there a possibility, for example, that you would take a look at any other bands that have not been specifically identified in the legislation, that just through your own scientists, engineers, what you're hearing from industry has made it seem like, wow, maybe we hadn't thought of that and that looks like it's potentially interesting? Or no, the field of things you're looking at has really been set and that's where you're going to focus your energy over the next many months?
Well, the bands we are studying is taking up a lot of energy already, but the range that Congress set out in the One Big Beautiful Bill is wider than the bands that are listed in the presidential memo. So it is 1.3, to 10.5. So I mean, it's certainly possible that some of those bands would be also looked at. Now, from our perspective, it's bands that have perspective, but also the law. It's our job is to come up with 500 megahertz of spectrum that is currently allocated to federal use, and then try to repurpose that to non-federal. So I think we will focus on that category of spectrum, but there's some of these other bands that there's a reason, right, that the range Congress gave us began at 1.3. Some of that spectrum has been sought after by the commercial broadband industry for a while. So I wouldn't say never is never, but we also we are busy beavers and we're already busy. It's pretty hard. I will say the 500 that we're supposed to come up with for re-auction, it would have to go to the FCC by 2034. So there is some limit, right? They lose their auction authority, at least for that range of spectrum, by 2034. So it's there's some guardrails, and I don't think I'll be here by 2034.
You never know. Maybe you'll be running the show, Trish.
Well, we'll see. Yeah,
Thank
that's
you.
my one-word answer.
Thank you very, very much for the time today. I know both of you need to jump. Jen, as always, it's fantastic to see you. Thank you for sharing the insights from the International Infrastructure event over in Germany. And Trish, really, thank you for the time. Thank you for your insights. We wish you the best of luck and much success in your new role. And you know where to find us.
All right. Thanks so much. It was great being with you, ladies.
Thanks so much, Trish. Great to see you both.
Okay. Give them hell in Berlin.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.